Now that you have a good understanding of the cardiovascular system and its primary function and response during exercise, which is generally to deliver oxygenated blood to working muscles, we now need to discuss the changes or enhancements, if you will, that occur as a result of adaptations to training. More specifically, a type of training called endurance training. Now, this is training that is intended to specifically improve muscular endurance. Now, of course, we will have to define muscular endurance so you understand the technical meaning of it. Then we will go into a good discussion on how endurance improves with training. Now, keep in mind, as we discussed during our resistance training adaptations lecture, training is referring to long-term exercise programs, meaning repeated bouts of exercise within a set time frame, which can be weeks to months. Now, you have to remember the fundamental aspects of training adaptations. The reason why our body or parts of our body like our muscles or the cardiovascular system enhances in their function with training is because it is adapting to a specific stressor. And as it adapts, the stress becomes less and less stressful. We discussed this concept as it relates to neuromuscular strength development earlier this semester. Now we are going to apply this very same concept as it relates to endurance training and the specific stressors that we adapt to during endurance training to ultimately improve muscular endurance. So as an overview of this lecture series, we will first define muscular endurance and then endurance training. We will talk about the fundamental aspects of endurance training. In other words, we will answer the question of what are we physiologically trying to achieve with endurance training and what type of stress must be applied during training so that we can adapt and improve endurance. Then we will talk about the physiological adaptations underlying the improvement of muscular endurance with training. And as a preview, these adaptations to endurance training occur in the cardiovascular system as well as in the muscle itself. In other words, improvements in muscular endurance result from adaptations and thus enhancements in both the cardiovascular system and in the skeletal muscle. Then we will conclude this lecture series with a brief discussion on endurance training principles. Now, I also want you all to know that this specific lecture series is last in this course because it is a segue into my 4000 level course called Exercise Bioenergetics and Metabolism, where I discuss the science of muscular fatigue and endurance in much more detail. So let's go ahead and begin. So first, what is muscular endurance? Now, many people would answer that endurance is simply how long one can exercise at whatever workload. However, this is not an accurate description of muscular endurance. In exercise science, an improvement in muscular endurance is defined as achieving and sustaining greater muscular work due to the mitigation of fatigue. Sustaining is the key word here. So for example, muscular endurance is not about simply how far you can run or how long you can run. It's rather about how much running speed or workload, in other words, that you can achieve and sustain without fatigue. So achieving greater muscular work without fatigue. Sustain is the important term here, as I said before. So to further this example, muscular endurance is not just about achieving, say, a running speed of 10 miles per hour, but also sustaining the 10 mile per hour without fatigue. So first, before we illustrate this concept further, let's discuss and recap the concept of muscular fatigue as presented in our bioenergetics lecture series earlier this semester. Now let's go ahead and use this figure here to the left, which was presented in that bioenergetics lecture. This figure represents how the aerobic and anaerobic system function during exercise across a spectrum of intensities from low to maximum intensity. Now, as intensity increases, we know that the rate at which ATP is needed is also increasing, and thus our bioenergetic systems will increase ATP production to meet that demand. Now, as emphasized in our bioenergetics lecture, the aerobic system, as represented by this Y curve, is the primary ATP producing system. And as you know by now, aerobic ATP production occurs in the mitochondria and is fully dependent on oxygen availability in the muscle. Now, as intensity or workload increases, aerobic ATP production ramps up to meet the increasing ATP demand. Now, at a particular intensity or workload, the aerobic system is unable to fully meet the ATP demand, and this is primarily due to insufficient oxygen availability. As we learned in the prior lecture, as exercise intensity and thus ATP demand increases, so does the oxygen demand because, again, the aerobic system requires more oxygen for more ATP production. Now, the intensity or workload at which the aerobic system cannot fully meet the ATP demand is referred to as the anaerobic threshold. So, because of insufficient oxygen availability, the aerobic system cannot fully satisfy the ATP demand, and thus a non-oxygen requiring system called the anaerobic system fills the portion of the ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot, and that is represented by the gray curve on top of the white curve. This is the anaerobic ATP production. So during exercise intensities above the anaerobic threshold or post-anaerobic threshold exercise, in other words, the anaerobic system simply backs up the aerobic system because there is insufficient oxygen available in the muscle cells to power further aerobic ATP production in the mitochondria for the aerobic system to fully meet the ATP demand. Now, one of the reasons why the oxygen availability does not meet the oxygen demand during post-anaerobic threshold exercise is due to the cardiovascular system's inability to deliver oxygenated blood to the muscles at a rate that is needed to meet the full ATP demand aerobically. So let's say, for example, a 10 mile per hour running workload is a post-anaerobic threshold workload. And as I just explained, this 10 mile per hour run would then involve the aerobic system unable to meet the full ATP demand due to insufficient oxygen availability, and thus the anaerobic system would be required to fulfill the remaining portion of the ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot. Now, during this 10 mile per hour run, there will be fatigue, and that 10 mile per hour workload cannot be sustained. No matter how hard you try, your muscles will, in essence, quote unquote, slow down, and contractions will become less forceful, making that 10 mile per hour workload unsustainable. So the question is, why does this happen? Why is it that when you exercise above your anaerobic threshold, there is fatigue? And why is that post-anaerobic threshold workload, like this 10 mile per hour run in this example, unsustainable? Well, first, this fatigue effect, as described above, is not due to the inability to meet the ATP demand of the working muscles. As you can see, even during post-anaerobic threshold exercise, the ATP demand is fully met, mostly by the aerobic system and partly by the anaerobic system. So the anaerobic system just simply exists to make sure that the full ATP demand is fulfilled. It simply backs up the aerobic system. So then, if it is not a matter of meeting the ATP demand, why during a post-anaerobic threshold workload does fatigue occur? It is because fatigue is a process of muscle self-inhibition in response to a hypoxic stress. I'll say that again. Fatigue is a process of muscle self-inhibition in response to a hypoxic stress. Now, hypoxia is not defined as no oxygen. It is defined as oxygen availability does not meet the oxygen demand, which is the main characteristic of post-anaerobic threshold exercise in muscle. And that is the whole reason why the anaerobic systems are needed to back up the aerobic system. And as we all should know, hypoxia for any cell in the body, including muscle cells, is a major stressor. It is a threat to the survival of the cell. So in the case of muscle cell, when you are contracting the muscle cells at an intensity or workload where the ATP demand requires X amount of oxygen to be fulfilled aerobically, but the oxygen availability is insufficient, this is hypoxia. So you can consider any workloads or intensities above the anaerobic threshold as a situation in which the muscle cells are under a hypoxic stress. And this stress becomes more and more severe as you increase workloads or intensities towards maximum intensity. Now, as you can see, as you go further above the anaerobic threshold intensity, there is an increasing portion of the ATP demand that cannot be filled aerobically, and there is a greater need for anaerobic backup. This means that the gap between the oxygen that is available versus the oxygen that is needed gets larger and larger as intensity increases further past the anaerobic threshold. Now you can view the top of this white curve as the oxygen that is available, that is powering the aerobic ATP production. And you can view the top of this entire curve as the oxygen that is needed for the aerobic system to fully meet the ATP demand. You can see the gap becomes larger and larger as you approach maximum intensity and you get further past your anaerobic threshold intensity. So this means as your workload increases further past the anaerobic threshold towards maximum intensity, that hypoxic stress becomes more and more severe, and thus fatigue becomes more and more severe, and thus that workload becomes more and more difficult to sustain. So let's go back to this example of the 10 mile per hour run workload. Because the 10 mile per hour run is at a workload above the anaerobic threshold, as you see here, there is a hypoxic stress present in the muscle cells. Therefore, the muscle will relieve itself from this stress by simply pumping its own brakes, by inhibiting the process of muscle contractions. In so doing, the muscle reduces the ATP and thus oxygen demand and forces the muscle down to a workload that is below the anaerobic threshold, thus relieving itself from the hypoxic stress associated with post-anaerobic threshold workloads. This process is called fatigue, more specifically acute muscular fatigue. So fatigue is essentially an immediate stress relief response mechanism. It is slowing the muscle down so that it can get out of a post-anaerobic threshold hypoxic situation to a pre-anaerobic threshold non-hypoxic situation. So say the running workload right below your anaerobic threshold is 6 miles per hour. So at 6 miles per hour, there is no fatigue because there is no hypoxic stress in the muscles, since it is below the anaerobic threshold, which means the oxygen availability meets the oxygen demand for the aerobic system to fully meet the ATP demand. You can see that the white curve covers the entire ATP demand, right below the anaerobic threshold. So when you run at 10 miles per hour, there is a hypoxic stress, and thus fatigue, which again is muscle self-inhibition, will force your muscle workload down to a 6 mile per hour workload below the anaerobic threshold and out of that hypoxic stress. So how do we improve endurance at this 10 mile per hour workload? How can we not only achieve this 10 mile per hour run workload, but also be able to sustain that 10 mile per hour workload by mitigating the effects of fatigue? In other words, in that example, how can one reduce or prevent fatigue during the 10 mile per hour run workload? Now, as you can see, muscular endurance is simply fatigue reduction. So how does that occur, at least conceptually? Fundamentally speaking, the 10 mile per hour workload needs to go from being a post-anaerobic threshold workload to a pre-anaerobic threshold workload. In so doing, the 10 mile per hour run will no longer be associated with a hypoxic stress. Thus, there is no longer a stimulus for that fatigue effect. Therefore, that 10 mile per hour run will at this point be sustainable for a longer period since there is no hypoxic stress and thus fatigue slowing you down. So then how is this achieved, at least conceptually? This is achieved by increasing what we call aerobic power, which is the ability to produce ATP aerobically at higher workloads or intensities and ATP demand. And this is illustrated by this figure here. Now, aerobic power is a function of both aerobic capacity and anaerobic threshold. We already refreshed what the anaerobic threshold represents. So as a refresher for the term aerobic capacity, the aerobic capacity is the maximum ATP producing ability of the aerobic system, or in other words, the mitochondria. So as you can see in this figure, as you undergo training, the white curve increases, raising the anaerobic threshold, as well as the aerobic capacity, which together again is described as an increase in aerobic power. As you can see here, at pre-training, the 10 mile per hour workload was above the anaerobic threshold, and thus hypoxic, and thus fatiguing. Endurance at 10 miles per hour was poor. Now, after say some weeks or months of training, your aerobic power increased so that the 10 mile per hour workload, which is placed on the exact same spot on the x-axis, is now below the anaerobic threshold. And thus, there is no hypoxic stress since now, at this 10 mile per hour workload, the oxygen demand that is required for the aerobic system to fully meet the ATP demand is now sufficiently available. Because there is now no hypoxic stress during this 10 mile per hour run workload, the 10 mile per hour run workload is non-fatiguing and thus sustainable. So before training, the 10 mile per hour workload was achievable but not sustainable due to fatigue. At post-training, so after weeks or months of training, the 10 mile per hour workload is now not only achievable but sustainable due to the mitigation of fatigue. And why is there no fatigue again? Because of the improvement in aerobic power, which is again the improvement in anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. That 10 mile per hour workload is now a pre-anaerobic threshold workload and thus without the fatigue-inducing hypoxic stress. Now, if we were to measure and quantify this enhancement in aerobic power, we need to measure anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. The measurement for anaerobic threshold are lactate and ventilatory thresholds. The measurement of aerobic capacity is VO2 max, or maximum oxygen consumption rate. It should make sense to you that the maximum oxygen consumption rate quantifies the maximum ATP producing power of the aerobic system, since again, the aerobic system's ability to produce ATP is completely dependent on the rate of oxygen consumption and thus availability. Now, in the last lecture, we discussed the factors that contribute to VO2 max, which have to do with the cardiovascular system's capacity to deliver oxygenated blood to muscle and for the muscle to uptake that oxygen. So we are alluding to the fact that an improvement in aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, has a lot to do with changes or adaptations that occur in the cardiovascular system. More on this later. So now the follow-up question is, well, how is aerobic power increased? The simple answer is through training. The more complex answer is by placing your muscles under this hypoxic stress associated with post-anaerobic threshold exercise frequently being the operative word here. As we learned earlier this semester when I discussed the science of strength development in response to resistance training, adaptations like those that improve aerobic power is a result of a frequent stressor to the body or parts of the body like the muscle. As I indicated earlier, the post-anaerobic threshold hypoxia in muscle is a stressor. It challenges the survival of the cell, and thus this is why the muscle inhibits itself through the process of fatigue to immediately remove that stress. But what happens if you frequently impose that post-anaerobic threshold hypoxic stress to the muscles week after week, meaning you perform post-anaerobic threshold / fatiguing exercise frequently week after week? We know as sophisticated biological organisms, we will adapt to this stressor so that stressor is no longer stressful. That adaptation will result in increased aerobic power, making exercise workloads that were once stressful no longer stressful. This is the exact same concept as resistance training adaptations and neuromuscular strength development in response to a mechanical stress to the muscle. So as I said, aerobic power and the factors that underpin it, which are anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity, is dependent on the ability for the aerobic system to meet ATP demands at higher workloads. And as we know, aerobic ATP production is fully dependent on oxygen availability as well as the efficiency of the muscle's mitochondria to produce ATP aerobically, which goes hand in hand with oxygen availability. So with that said, the primary objective of endurance training is to enhance the cardiovascular system and the muscle mitochondria to increase the ability for the muscles to generate ATP aerobically at higher workloads and ATP demands. This is the same thing as saying that the objective of endurance training is to enhance the cardiovascular system and the muscle mitochondria to increase aerobic power. In so doing, the 10 mile per hour workload, as in that example provided, is not only achievable but also sustainable due to the mitigation of hypoxic stress and fatigue. And since endurance training must impose frequent hypoxic stress to elicit adaptations and thus improvements in aerobic power, endurance training is really anaerobic threshold or post-anaerobic threshold training, as training at intensities below the anaerobic threshold will not provide the appropriate stressor required for adaptations leading to improved aerobic power and muscular endurance. So endurance training is anaerobic threshold to post-anaerobic threshold training, because that is the only way that the stress will be imposed for the adaptations to take place that would lead to increased aerobic power and muscular endurance. Now, the adaptations to endurance training are multifactorial and multi-organ, all converging to improve aerobic power, which again is a function of aerobic capacity as measured by VO2 max and aerobic threshold as measured via lactate or ventilatory thresholds. We can compartmentalize the physiological adaptations to endurance training as cardiovascular adaptations and muscle adaptations, also known as metabolic adaptations. Now, in this course, we are going to mainly focus on cardiovascular adaptations to endurance training. I will introduce the muscle adaptations and discuss it briefly at the end of this lecture series, but it will be more of a transition into my exercise bioenergetics course, which I will discuss these specific adaptations in much more advanced detail. So as you can see by this figure, adaptations in both the cardiovascular system and skeletal muscle itself to the frequent stresses imposed by post-anaerobic threshold training, aka endurance training, all lead to an improvement in aerobic power as represented by the increased white curve in the figure in the prior slide. Let's break down this figure first, and later we will discuss each component in much more detail, particularly the cardiovascular adaptations. So first, the cardiovascular adaptations. As an adaptation to the frequent stress imposed during endurance training, there is an increase in maximum cardiac output, or Q. Now, if you remember the definition of cardiac output from the prior lecture, you would know that it is the volume of blood ejected from the left ventricle per minute. So in other words, it's the volume of oxygenated blood ejected from the heart to the rest of the body like muscle every minute. It is a measure of arterial blood flow from the heart. So maximum cardiac output represents maximum oxygenated blood flow. Next, under cardiovascular adaptations, there is increased muscle capillary density. Remember, the capillary network is where exchange occurs between the blood and the tissue that the capillaries surround. So in this case, the capillaries around muscle become more dense through a process called angiogenesis, formation of blood vessels like capillaries. There is greater coverage of the muscle with capillary blood vessels, which means more blood perfusion and thus more oxygenated blood delivery and uptake of oxygen by the muscles. Finally, there is increased oxygen carrying capacity in the arterial blood, in addition to increased extraction of oxygen by muscle cells from the arterial blood through the capillary network. So altogether, these individual cardiovascular adaptations to endurance training function to overall improve oxygen availability, particularly in muscle. Now, how would this outcome relate to the adaptation to the stress of frequent hypoxia? Remember, the hypoxic stress associated with post-anaerobic threshold exercise is characterized by the oxygen availability not meeting the oxygen required for the aerobic system to fully satisfy the ATP demand. In other words, the oxygen availability does not meet the oxygen demand during post-anaerobic threshold exercise. This is again hypoxia, and it is a stressor to the muscle. So one way to mitigate hypoxia at a workload that used to induce hypoxia would be to increase the availability of oxygen to the muscle. And these cardiovascular adaptations do just that. So with that, you have enhancements in aerobic power. Now, we will, as I said, discuss this much further later, but take note that these cardiovascular adaptations improve aerobic power mainly through the enhancement of aerobic capacity, with minor effects on anaerobic threshold. In other words, cardiovascular adaptations primarily impact VO2 max, which again is maximum oxygen consumption rate, which is the measure of aerobic capacity. Now, more on this in a few moments. Now, on the other side, we have adaptations that occur specifically in the muscle itself. Now remember, aerobic ATP production occurs in the mitochondria, and the mitochondria can undergo adaptations during endurance training to become, in essence, more quote unquote powerful. The primary adaptation that is observed in muscle in response to endurance training is mitochondrial biogenesis, the formation of mitochondria. So during endurance training, as a response to the stress of hypoxia at a given post-anaerobic threshold workload, the muscle increases production of mitochondria, which of course impacts the mitochondrial number in individual muscle cells. This means there are more aerobic ATP producing power plants within each muscle cell, which would directly improve aerobic power. Now, keep in mind, accompanying mitochondrial biogenesis is an increase in the size of individual mitochondria in each muscle cell. And this occurs along with an increase in density of each mitochondria. Both of these outcomes occur because individual mitochondria increases synthesis of quote unquote materials required for aerobic ATP production, such as electron transport chain structures. Thus, with an increase in size and density of individual mitochondria, you have increased quote unquote power of each individual mitochondria in each of those muscle cells. Now, since mitochondrial biogenesis typically accompanies increases in the size and density of mitochondria, the term mitochondrial biogenesis is used to describe an increase in the number, size, and density of mitochondria, since they all occur simultaneously. Altogether, these enhancements to the muscle mitochondria directly impact the power of the mitochondria to produce ATP aerobically, and thus directly impacts aerobic power. And as I said, as cardiovascular adaptations primarily impact aerobic power through influence on aerobic capacity, the muscle adaptations through the adaptations in the mitochondria impact aerobic power primarily through its influence on anaerobic threshold. So again, the muscle adaptations, which include mitochondrial biogenesis, which in turn increase mitochondrial power, will impact positively aerobic power through its influence on anaerobic threshold. In other words, it increases anaerobic threshold. So altogether, these two adaptations, the cardiovascular and the muscle adaptations, improve aerobic power by increasing anaerobic threshold and aerobic capacity. Cardiovascular adaptations improve aerobic capacity, muscle adaptations improve anaerobic threshold. So to summarize, this figure is the breakdown of the specific adaptations that contribute to an increase in aerobic power with endurance training, allowing that 10 mile per hour workload in the previous example to go from being a post-anaerobic threshold hypoxic and fatiguing workload to a pre-anaerobic threshold non-hypoxic and non-fatiguing and thus sustainable workload. So let's get into these adaptations in much more detail, starting off with our main topic, the cardiovascular adaptations. So why do you think we refer to endurance exercise as quote unquote cardio? Well, it is possibly because it is well known both in the scientific and fitness communities that the most prominent physiological adaptations to endurance training occur in the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular adaptations to endurance training, which again is anaerobic threshold to post-anaerobic threshold training, as briefly outlined earlier, can improve the capacity by which your muscles generate ATP aerobically. In other words, aerobic power. The question is, how? The general answer is that the cardiovascular system becomes more efficient in delivering oxygen to working muscles, thereby improving the oxygen availability in muscle, especially during exercise. So let's see how the cardiovascular system, more specifically cardiovascular function, changes as one engages in endurance training. What specific changes occur in cardiovascular function that leads to improved oxygen availability and thus aerobic power? To answer these questions, let's examine the changes that occur in each of those cardiac variables that I introduced in the prior lecture series. First, let's start with stroke volume. As a refresher, stroke volume is the volume of oxygenated blood ejected from the left ventricle per contraction or heartbeat. Now, you may remember this graph from the prior lecture, But in that lecture, we only had one line just to simply demonstrate how stroke volume responds at varying intensities of exercise. We know that stroke volume increases linearly with intensity until a 50% VO2 max intensity where it maxes out. In this lecture series, we have now two lines. The red line here represents the stroke volume response to exercise at pre-training, so before starting an endurance training program. And the blue line here represents how the stroke volume response to exercise changes at given intensities after some time of endurance training. So in other words, post-training. So we have pre-training and post-training stroke volume responses at given intensities of exercise. So first, let's look at submaximal stroke volume, which is the stroke volume below the maximum stroke volume. This is this line right here. As you can see, submaximal stroke volume increases from pre to post training. You can see that the submaximal line goes from here to here after some weeks or months of training. Now, what about maximal stroke volume, which is this line right here? As you can see, just like submaximal stroke volume, maximal stroke volume increases with training. It goes from here to here. So altogether, submaximal and maximal stroke volume increase with training, meaning at any given intensity, whether submaximal or maximal, the heart is pumping out more blood per beat. So just to put some numbers to it, say you are exercising at 25% VO2 max. The stroke volume at pre-training at this intensity was about 80 milliliters per beat. After some weeks or months of training, at 25% VO2 max, the stroke volume improved to say about 115 milliliters per beat. So more blood ejected from the left ventricle per beat. This is an example of changes in submaximal stroke volume. So what about maximal stroke volume? Now before training, the maximal stroke volume was a little bit above 90 milliliters per beat. After some weeks or months of training, that maximum stroke volume improved to about 135 milliliters per beat. So altogether, submaximal and maximal stroke volume increases with training, meaning at any given intensity, whether submaximal or maximal, the heart is pumping out more blood per beat. Now, this adaptation in stroke volume is driven by these three interrelated factors. First, there is increased blood volume from pre to post training. So over time, as you engage in training, there will be more blood volume, and with that, more blood volume returning to the heart. So greater ventricular filling. And with this, you also have increased left ventricular volume, meaning the ventricle can fill up with more blood. So what does this do in accordance to the Frank-Starling law, which we discussed in the previous lecture? That would increase the force of ventricular contraction, thereby ejecting more blood per contraction or heartbeat, aka increased stroke volume. And again, submaximal and maximal stroke volume increases with training. Now, what about submaximal and maximal heart rate? How does submaximal heart rate change across a period of endurance training? As you see here, submaximal heart rate decreases as you progress through endurance training. This means at any given submaximal intensity, heart rate is lower. Why? The main reason is because each beat is stronger and more blood is pumped out per beat, as described in the prior slide. Because of this increased stroke volume, the heart does not need to pump as fast to eject the same volume of blood as it did before training started. In essence, each heartbeat has become much more efficient from pre to post training, so the heart can beat at a lower rate. What does not change, however, is maximum heart rate or heart rate max. As you can see, the max heart rate lines overlap from pre to post training. No matter how long you train, the max heart rate will not change or improve. It will be mostly maintained. So in summary, with training, sub-max heart rate decreases while max heart rate does not change. Okay, now let's put this all together. Remember, heart rate and stroke volume are the factors underlying cardiac output, or Q for short. Thus, Q equals heart rate times stroke volume. And remember, cardiac output is the volume of oxygenated blood ejected from the heart per minute. So using this equation, let's see how submaximal and maximal cardiac output changes from pre to post training. First, Submaximal cardiac output does not change from pre to post training. You can see that the pre and post training lines are overlapped at submaximal levels. Why? Well, let's take a look at the underlying factors of submaximal cardiac output, which would be submaximal heart rate and submaximal stroke volume. As we indicated in the last two slides, submaximal heart rate decreases with training, while submaximal stroke volume increases with training. Thus, these factors offset one another, resulting in no change in submaximal cardiac output. So what about maximal cardiac output as you see here, which again represents the maximal rate of oxygenated blood flow from the heart per minute? As you see here and introduced earlier, maximal cardiac output increases with training. So what is a major contributor to this increase in maximal cardiac output? Remember, maximal heart rate does not change with training, but maximal stroke volume increases with training. So the only contributor to an increase in maximal cardiac output from pre to post training is an increase in maximal stroke volume. There will be an exam question on this, so please take note. So if I asked which of the following factors contribute to an increase in maximum cardiac output from pre to post training, the only answer is increased maximal stroke volume. Now here we have a non-graphical representation of the changes in submax and maximal cardiac output. Once again, submaximal cardiac output does not change from pre to post training because submaximal heart rate decreases while submaximal stroke volume increases, offsetting one another. However, maximal cardiac output increases from pre to post training, not because heart rate max increases, but because maximum stroke volume increases with training. And this improvement in maximum cardiac output is the most significant cardiovascular adaptation to endurance training. So now we know how the heart function changes with training. The maximum cardiac output increases from pre to post training, again, not due to an increase in max heart rate, but an increase in max stroke volume. Now, what about at the microvessel level in the capillary network surrounding muscle tissue? Are there any changes there that could increase oxygen availability to muscle? Yes, there is. These changes at the microvessel level is reflected by changes in arterial minus venous O2 difference, which again is the difference between arterial and venous oxygen content, which represents the amount of oxygen that is extracted from blood passing through the capillaries of muscle cells. So first, let's see how AVO2 difference changes from rest to maximum exercise intensity at a pre-training status, so before one starts their training program. At rest, 5 milliliters of oxygen is extracted per deciliter of arterial blood as it passes through all the capillaries. There is 20 milliliters of oxygen per deciliter of arterial blood. 5 milliliters is extracted by tissues at the capillary level, and 15 milliliters return to the heart via the veins in venous blood. At maximum intensity exercise, of course, the muscle tissue will extract more oxygen from the arterial blood, since the muscle requires more oxygen for aerobic ATP production. So as the 20 milliliters of oxygen in a deciliter of arterial blood passes through the capillaries, 15 milliliters of oxygen is extracted mostly by active muscles, and only 5 milliliters of oxygen return back to the heart through venous return. So at pre-training, maximum AVO2 difference is 15 milliliters. This means 15 milliliters of oxygen is extracted at maximum intensity, and this is again at pre-training. So at rest, you have 5 milliliters of oxygen extraction, and at maximum exercise, you have 15 milliliters of oxygen extraction. Now, how does this response change over time with training? How does resting AVO2 difference change? Meaning, how does the amount of oxygen extracted by tissues change at rest? Well, it doesn't. No matter how much or how long you train for, resting AVO2 difference does not change. It stays at 5 milliliters per deciliter of blood, meaning your tissues do not extract more oxygen at rest from pre to post training. But what about maximum intensity exercise? How does maximum AVO2 difference change with training? Meaning, how does maximum oxygen extraction change with training? Well, let's take a look. Arterial oxygen content never changes. It is always 20 milliliters of oxygen per deciliter of blood. This is 100% oxygenation. But as you can see, less oxygen is returning back to the heart at max intensity, which means more oxygen is being extracted, especially by active muscles. So as an adaptation to endurance training, this increase in maximum AVO2 difference indicates an increased capacity for working muscles to extract oxygen from arterial blood. Now, would this effect improve the oxygen availability for muscle cells, especially at higher workloads? Yes, it would. So as a summary, maximum AVO2 difference improves with training, while resting AVO2 difference does not change with training. So remember earlier, I said that the cardiovascular adaptations to endurance training ultimately improve aerobic power by increasing aerobic capacity. And you should know by now that aerobic capacity is measured by VO2 max, maximum oxygen consumption rate. This means that the cardiovascular adaptations to endurance training increases VO2 max, or aerobic capacity. So how can we explain this improvement in VO2 max with the information that was just discussed? We have to remember the Fick equation, which states that VO2, oxygen consumption rate, equals cardiac output times AVO2 difference. This means VO2 max equals maximum cardiac output times maximum AVO2 difference. As we just discussed, as an adaptation to endurance training, there is an increase in maximum cardiac output, driven by an increase in maximum stroke volume. There is also an increase in AVO2 difference max, which represents a greater capacity for oxygen extraction by muscles. So when you put this together, if both of these maximal variables increase with training, then how would VO2 max change with training? It would increase. So this is why athletes perform VO2 max testing before and after training to measure how much improvement in aerobic power or fitness has been achieved. So let's put all this information into a practical context. What does this increase in cardiac output max mean? It means that there is an increased capacity to deliver oxygenated blood to working muscles. And what does an increase in maximum AVO2 difference represent? It represents an increased capacity for working muscles to extract oxygen from arterial blood. So with all that together, we know that this will increase VO2 max, aerobic capacity. This increase in VO2 max and thus aerobic capacity indicates that there is an increased maximum rate of oxygen consumption and therefore more support for aerobic ATP production through increased oxygen availability. So how does this improvement in VO2 max translate to human performance? Now let's go ahead and use these figures again and a 10 mile per hour workload as an example once more. So at pre-training, your aerobic power is represented by this white curve. We see that the 10 mile per hour running workload is well above the anaerobic threshold, but we also see that the aerobic capacity or VO2 max is pretty low. Now, as a result of training, we know generally that aerobic power increases with the cardiovascular adaptations primarily contributing to this increase in aerobic capacity or VO2 max. This is again driven by an increase in maximum cardiac output and maximum AVO2 difference. Now, as a result of these adaptations, this 10 mile per hour workload is now a pre-anaerobic threshold workload and is less fatiguing because of the absence of that hypoxic stress. But how does this increase in VO2 max affect the performance of this 10 mile per hour workload specifically? What it does is reduce the relative intensity as a percentage of VO2 max of that 10 mile per hour run. Here is an example of what I mean by this. Say at pre-training that 10 mile per hour run equated to 85% of VO2 max. Let's say at pre-training your VO2 max was 50 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. So 85% of that is 42.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute, which means at a 10 mile per hour running workload, you are only able to consume 42.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute to support aerobic ATP production. Now, as you train for a while and experience adaptations like those cardiovascular adaptations we just discussed, your VO2 max improves. Your aerobic capacity, therefore, improves. Let's say it improves from 50 to 65 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Now, that 10 mile per hour workload is at a relative intensity of 70% VO2 max, meaning the relative intensity of the same workload of 10 miles per hour is reduced from pre to post training, which makes sense, right? A given workload becomes less intense as you get in better shape. So what does this mean in relation to VO2 max? Well, 70% of a new VO2 max of 65 equates to 45.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, meaning at a 10 mile per hour workload, you are now able to consume 45.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute compared to pre-training where you were only able to consume 42.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute at that same 10 mile per hour workload. Again, this means at the same 10 mile per hour workload from pre to post training, you are able to now consume more oxygen, which means more oxygen availability to support aerobic ATP production. Now, as we know, aerobic capacity / VO2 max is only one factor underlying aerobic power. In fact, it is not considered the most critical factor for most, which means anaerobic threshold is another factor that must be carefully understood and considered when talking about improvements in aerobic power with training. So the question we need to address now is an increase in VO2 max or aerobic capacity the only factor for enhanced muscular endurance? The direct answer to that is no, because there are two factors that contribute to aerobic power, the other being anaerobic threshold. In fact, for well-trained individuals, VO2 max or aerobic capacity is not the most important factor because within 12 to 18 months of proper endurance training, you could achieve the highest possible VO2 max you can ever obtain. And the highest VO2 max possible for any individual is primarily genetically determined. Some individuals have a higher VO2 max potential than others, but that is not the main point here. The main point is that with just a year or more of training, you could reach your VO2 max potential, and no further increases in VO2 max would be possible. So does achieving the highest possible VO2 max indicate that you cannot further enhance endurance performance? No, not at all. So let's discuss this concept by using this example here, which represents a very common scenario in the world of elite endurance sports. So here we have an endurance elite athlete who is pretty much well trained. And this athlete runs the 10K. Now we see before starting his 2-year training program, his VO2 max was at 71 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. His 10K time / performance was 40 minutes. And his average run pace or workload was 15 kilometers per hour. Then he underwent 2 years of hardcore endurance training. And after 2 years of training, his VO2 max did not change. It was maintained at 71. It would be safe to say that 71 is the highest VO2 max he could possibly achieve. And again, that is determined by his genetics. But look at his 10K performance. His 10K time improved from 40 minutes to about 34 minutes. And that was because his average run pace or workload during the 10K improved from 15 kilometers per hour to 17.5 kilometers per hour. So even without an increase in VO2 max or aerobic capacity, there was a significant improvement in aerobic power and thus muscular endurance, and 10K performance or average workload improved accordingly. So how does this occur? So the main goal during a 10K race, or any race for that matter, is to run at a workload right below your anaerobic threshold workload so that you don't experience fatigue. So for this athlete at pre-training, he could only maintain an average run pace of 15 kilometers per hour during the 10K because that is the workload right below his anaerobic threshold. If he was to run at 17.5 kilometers per hour, he would have fatigued during the 10K, and that would have been detrimental to his 10K time. A 17.5 kilometer per hour workload at pre-training would have been fatiguing because, as you can see here, this workload is a post-anaerobic threshold workload, and thus there will be a hypoxic stress causing fatigue. So what changed with training over the 2 years? Well, we know that aerobic power increases. Now, what we said was in this example that aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, however, did not improve because it has reached its highest possible. You can see that aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, has not changed from pre to post training. But what did change over those 2 years of training? The other factor of aerobic power, anaerobic threshold. As you see here, anaerobic threshold improved across 2 years of endurance training. So now the former average run pace of 15 kilometers per hour is way below his new anaerobic threshold and is too quote unquote easy. Now he is able to maintain an improved run pace or workload of 17.5 kilometers per hour because that workload went from being a post anaerobic threshold workload to now a pre-anaerobic threshold workload, slightly below his anaerobic threshold workload. This means that there is less hypoxic stress and fatigue during a 17.5 kilometer per hour run workload. Now, think of the anaerobic threshold as the red line on a vehicle's tachometer. At pre-training, the runner's red line was at 15 kilometers per hour, but with training, that red line improved to 17.5 kilometers per hour, which means he can run at 17.5 kilometers per hour during the race without fatigue. Now, this is an example of improved muscular endurance, and in this case, it occurred without any improvements in VO2 max. So as you can see, improvements in VO2 max is not so critical with well-trained athletes, but anaerobic threshold is, and it is the variable that is tested most frequently with well-trained endurance athletes. So just to reiterate, anaerobic threshold is the more critical factor for aerobic power versus aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, since highly trained endurance athletes do not experience much improvements in VO2 max since they have already achieved the highest possible due to the length of their overall training. Now, also, as you can see in this photo, in endurance performance like during professional cycling, VO2 max is not the main determinant of performance. As shown here, the top 3 finishers for the Tour de France had similar VO2 max scores, and this VO2 max score is similar across all the competitors. So in trained endurance athletes such as those shown here, anaerobic threshold is much more of an important factor in the improvement of aerobic power and thus endurance. Now, to better understand the practical implications of improved aerobic power, more specifically improved anaerobic threshold, I want to present some experimental data here that I collected on elite marathoners and also recreationally active individuals, the average Joe, if you will. Now, the test we had both of these groups undergo was a 13.1 mile per hour run to failure treadmill test, and this test involved just what the description implies. We had subjects in both groups run at a constant speed of 13.1 miles per hour on a treadmill, and we simply tested how long they could sustain that workload for. A few days before this test, we also tested a subject's anaerobic threshold as well as VO2 max. The anaerobic threshold was measured via ventilatory threshold testing, which is an alternative to lactate threshold testing, and VO2 max was measured to quantify the aerobic capacity. So why 13.1 miles per hour? Well, this is an important test for marathoners because a 13.1 mile per hour average run pace equates to a sub 2-hour marathon race time, which is the ultimate goal for competitive marathoners. So we wanted to see how long the elite marathoners can sustain a 13.1 mile per hour workload and compare that to the average Joe. Now, I'm sure you can imagine how fast 13.1 miles per hour is running on a treadmill. It is pretty fast. To some of us, 13.1 miles per hour is an all-out sprint speed. Now, let's take a look at the results. First, let's take a look at how long the average Joe subjects could sustain the 13.1 miles per hour run. These average Joe subjects were just the everyday recreationally active individuals. So subject 1 was able to sustain that 13.1 mile per hour speed for only 1 minute and 30 seconds. Subject 2, 54 seconds. Subject 3, 1 minute and 12 seconds. Subject 4, only 25 seconds. Subject 5, 1 minute and 20 seconds, with an average for the average Joe of 1 minute and 4 seconds, meaning on average, the average Joes could only sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run workload for only 1 minute and 4 seconds. Now let's take a look at the elite marathoners and see how long each subject in this group was able to sustain a 13.1 mile per hour running workload. Subject 1, 1 hour, 57 minutes, and 32 seconds. Subject 2, 1 hour, 42 minutes, and 10 seconds. Subject 3, 2 hours and 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Subject 4, 1 hour, 58 minutes and 16 seconds. Subject 5, 2 hours, 1 minute, 18 seconds, with an average of 1 hour, 56 minutes, and 18 seconds. So as you can clearly see, the elite marathoners did not experience muscular fatigue running at 13.1 miles per hour, while the average Joes clearly did. And just as a note, the only reason these marathoners stopped was not because of fatigue, but because of something called exhaustion, which is different from fatigue. Exhaustion is when you run out of fuel, more specifically muscle glycogen. So basically, the marathoners stopped their test because they ran out of fuel, not because of fatigue. The average Joe had to stop their test because of fatigue, which again was elicited by the hypoxic stress associated with the 13.1 mile per hour workload. Now remember, muscular endurance is about not only achieving a higher workload, but sustaining that workload. So yes, the average Joe can achieve the 13.1 mile per hour workload, but can they sustain it? No, they cannot. They didn't have good endurance at 13.1 miles per hour. Now, this data also demonstrates that simply achieving 13.1 miles per hour is possible for many, but sustaining 13.1 miles per hour without fatigue is a whole nother story. Achieving and sustaining such a high workload is exemplary of muscular endurance, as shown by the elite marathoners. So the important question is why? Why is the elite marathoner able to maintain 13.1 miles per hour for a significantly longer time than the average Joe? The obvious answer is the average Joe during the 13.1 mile per hour run experienced muscular fatigue, while the elite marathoner did not. But what explains this from a physiological perspective? Let's take a look at the aerobic measures from the other exercise lab tests and compare between the groups. First, the average Joe. Let's look at their VO2 max, which again is maximum oxygen consumption rate and is a quantification of aerobic capacity, which is the maximum ATP producing capacity of the aerobic system. For the average Joes, subject 1 had a VO2 max of 60 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. Subject 2, 54. Subject 3, 58. Subject 4, 42. Subject 5, 58. And an average for the average Joes of 54 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. Now, in all honesty, compared to norm values, these numbers are not terrible. They are somewhat average for the general population within their age range. Now let's take a look at the intensity at which the anaerobic threshold was observed. The intensity is reflected as a percentage of VO2 max. So for subject 1, their anaerobic threshold is at 60% of VO2 max, 58% VO2 max for subject 2, 62% for subject 3, 50% VO2 max for subject 4, 58% VO2 max for subject 5, and the average anaerobic threshold for the average Joe was at an intensity of 58% VO2 max. Now, during the 13.1 mile per hour run test, we hooked up the subjects to a metabolic cart and we measured their oxygen consumption rate, their VO2, and we calculated the intensity of that 13.1 mile per hour run relative to their VO2 max, so as a percentage of their VO2 max. So for subject 1, the 13.1 mile per hour run was a relative intensity of 80% of their VO2 max, so pretty high intensity. So for this case, was that 13.1 mile per hour run a workload above or below their anaerobic threshold? Well, the 13.1 mile per hour run was an intensity of 80% VO2 max, and their anaerobic threshold was observed at an intensity of 60% VO2 max. So yes, that 13.1 mile per hour run was significantly above subject 1's anaerobic threshold. So this means subject 1 was under a hypoxic stress during that 13.1 mile per hour test, and thus fatigue was stimulated to force a reduction in the workload to get out of that hypoxic stress. So in summary, subject 1 was only able to sustain the 13.1 mile per hour run for only a minute and 30 seconds because that workload was at an intensity above their anaerobic threshold. And you should be confident in understanding that the fatigue subject 1 experienced was in response to that hypoxic stress. Now let's look at subject number 2. Same story as subject number 1. The 13.1 mile per hour run was at a relative intensity of 82% VO2 max, which is higher than the intensity at which their anaerobic threshold is observed, which was 58% of their VO2 max. This means subject 2 was way above their anaerobic threshold during the 13.1 mile per hour run. Thus, conceivably, subject 2 may have experienced greater hypoxic stress and thus fatigue compared to subject 1, and that is reflected in subject 2's performance. Subject 2 was only able to sustain that run for only 54 seconds. Now, if you look at subject 3, 4, and 5, we have the same situation. If you look at subject 4 in particular, you can see that he performed the worst. He could only sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run for only 25 seconds. Let's look at the relative intensity of that 13.1 mile per hour run for this subject. It was 90% of his VO2 max, which means that the 13.1 mile per hour workload is near maximum intensity for this subject. What was the intensity of the subject's anaerobic threshold? It was pretty low, 50% VO2 max. So subject 4 was way above their anaerobic threshold, and thus the hypoxic stress was comparatively more severe, and thus fatigue was comparatively more severe than the other subjects in the average Joe group. Now let's take a look at the elite marathoners. We obviously know that they were able to sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run for significantly longer, almost 2 hours. And I think all of you can guess by now that the 13.1 mile per hour workload was at an intensity below their anaerobic threshold. Let's take a look at their testing data. Of course, as you can expect, their VO2 max, which again is a measure of aerobic capacity, was significantly greater than the average Joes. On average, the VO2 max of the elite marathoners was 81 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute, which is significantly greater than the 54 average for the average Joes. But as we know, VO2 max is only one factor of aerobic power, meaning it's not the only important factor for endurance performance. Let's take a look at the elite marathoners' anaerobic threshold, again as reflected by a percentage of their VO2 max. Subject 1 had an anaerobic threshold intensity of 78% VO2 max. Subject 2 had an anaerobic threshold intensity of 80% VO2 max. Subject 3, 79% VO2 max. Subject 4, 87% VO2 max. Subject 5, 84% VO2 max. And an average anaerobic threshold of 82% VO2 max. You can clearly see that the elite marathoners had a significantly greater anaerobic threshold intensity compared to the average Joe. But what's more important is the relative intensity of that 13.1 mile per hour run for the elite marathoners. So let's take a look at subject 1. The 13.1 mile per hour run was a relative intensity of 75% of that subject's VO2 max. So was this intensity post or pre-anaerobic threshold? It was a pre-anaerobic threshold intensity. The intensity of the 13.1 mile per hour run was lower than the intensity at which the anaerobic threshold was observed. Therefore, subject 1 did not experience hypoxic stress in their muscles during that 13.1 mile per hour run workload. Therefore, they did not experience fatigue. There was no stimulus or reason for fatigue. Now, if you look at subjects 2, 3, 4, and 5, we have the same situation. The intensity of their 13.1 mile per hour run test was less than their individual anaerobic threshold intensities. So as you can see, on average for the elite marathoners, that 13.1 mile per hour run was at a relative intensity lower than their anaerobic threshold intensity. And this is why the elite marathoners were able to sustain that 13.1 mile per hour run for almost 2 hours straight. They did not experience muscular fatigue because there was no hypoxic stress to stimulate that fatigue. So from this data, you can clearly see the importance of aerobic power in endurance performance, which again is being able to achieve and sustain greater muscular work. And just as a reminder, aerobic power is a function of both VO2 max and anaerobic threshold. Now, as I alluded to earlier, for the elite marathoner, VO2 max at this level of competition and training is not the most important factor, because for these individuals, due to their extensive training history, they have achieved the highest possible VO2 max they can ever achieve, and this is again genetically determined. As you can see, their VO2 max scores are very high compared to norm values. So for very well-trained individuals such as these elite marathoners, the goal outcome of their training is, yes, to improve aerobic power, but more specifically, anaerobic threshold. They want to get that anaerobic threshold intensity as close to 100% VO2 max as possible. Now, as I introduced earlier, endurance training adaptations are not just in the cardiovascular system, but also in the skeletal muscle itself. I also mentioned we are only going to introduce these muscle adaptations and briefly discuss them, since this is a major topic in my 4000 level course. So one of the adaptations that we see in skeletal muscle in response to endurance training is a shift in muscle fiber type. As most of us know, muscle fibers can be broken down into two major types, type 1 and type 2. Type 2 also has two subtypes, type 2A and type 2X. Now, these two types of fibers, which one has generally greater aerobic power? It is type 1 that has comparatively greater aerobic power than type 2. Type 1 fibers have greater mitochondria and aerobic ATP producing power. Now, one of the many reasons that could explain the difference between the average Joe and the elite marathoners is their muscle fiber type distribution. We can confidently assume that the elite marathoners had a greater distribution of type 1 muscle fibers across their entire musculature compared to the average Joes, who likely have an average fiber type distribution of 50% type 1 and 50% type 2 distribution. So the question is, can we, through endurance training, gain more of a fiber type distribution like the elite marathoner? Yes, to some limited extent. Here I have the title of one of my papers that discusses the research in the area of fiber type shifting with different modes of training. And in this paper, we discussed that with long-term endurance training, there can be a shift towards a greater type 1 fiber type distribution, meaning you can shift your type 2 fibers to a more aerobic type 1. And this will be conducive to greater aerobic power, since again, type 1 fibers are more aerobically powerful. Now, the traditional thought was that fiber type distribution cannot change and that you are born with a certain fiber type distribution and that is what you have for the rest of your life. And it was thought that fiber type distribution was genetically determined and not modifiable even with training. However, over the years of muscle research, there is a growing body of evidence that refutes this contention. There are evidence that suggests with repeated stress like during endurance training, type 2 fibers, particular type 2A fibers, can shift into a type 1 fiber, or at least become more characteristic of type 1 fibers. So recently, my colleagues and I tested this hypothesis to challenge the notion that fiber type distribution is genetically determined and unmodifiable. We conducted a case study on two brothers who were monozygous twins, identical twins in other words, with 99.9% identical genotype or genetic makeup. The reason why we studied these brothers in particular is because one brother was a lifelong endurance athlete while the other brother was more or less sedentary all his life. We conducted multiple lab tests on each brother, including measurements of VO2 max and anaerobic threshold, as well as muscle biopsies to analyze their fiber type distribution. Here in these figures is an illustration of what we found. We found that the twin brother who was a lifelong endurance athlete who is still training had a significantly greater type 1 fiber type distribution than his sedentary brother. So if the traditional thought of fiber type distribution not being modifiable and genetically determined was true, these two brothers, regardless of their training history, should have identical fiber type distribution. We found, again, that this was not the case. Now, of course, many other factors could have contributed to the difference in fiber type distribution between these brothers, but it is with good amount of confidence that the training and exercise history discrepancies was the determining factor. So yes, we have evidence to suggest that as an adaptation to endurance training, fiber type shifting can occur towards a type 1 dominant distribution. Now, what I will say is this about genetic predispositions. I do believe that genetics plays a significant role in fiber type distribution. Genetics may influence fiber type distribution by regulating how much shifting can occur in response to training. And this may be one of the reasons why not everyone can become an elite marathoner, at least from a muscle genetics perspective. In other words, no matter how much the average Joe trains like these elite marathoners, they may never become elite, partly because genetics limits the capacity by which their muscle fibers can shift. Now, of course, this is just one of the many factors that is limited by genetics as it relates to human performance. Now, as I indicated towards the beginning of this lecture, the primary muscle adaptation to endurance training is mitochondrial biogenesis, which I emphasize not only describes an increased number of mitochondria per muscle cell, but also an increase in the size and density of individual mitochondria. And that is depicted here. These changes in mitochondria directly impact the efficiency of aerobic metabolism. In other words, it improves the overall ability for aerobic ATP production within the muscle. This can be described as an improvement in mitochondrial power, and this is aided by an increase in oxygen carrying capacity in the muscle cells, meaning the muscle cells have an improved ability to extract oxygen from arterial blood and carry it to the mitochondria where it is needed. This is largely mediated by an increase in the muscle cell's oxygen-carrying protein, myoglobin. The oxygen-carrying protein in blood, as most of us know, is hemoglobin, and the same version of that protein in muscle is called myoglobin. So with an increase in mitochondria number, size, and density, together with an increase in oxygen-carrying capacity in the muscle, there is an increase in the ATP-producing power of the aerobic system, as illustrated here. So to conclude, we have some key training principles based on the science we discussed in this lecture series. First, the most important aspect of endurance training is that you must train near or above your anaerobic threshold to optimize adaptations towards improved aerobic power and endurance. This is the only way to impose the appropriate stress to stimulate these adaptations. So in my exercise bioenergetics course, which is a 4,000 level course, we will talk about all the different and more practical ways to test your anaerobic threshold so that you know how to apply intensities appropriately during your training, so that you know that you have enough stress to elicit adaptations and thus improvements in aerobic power and muscular endurance. So yes, even when you do exercise way above the anaerobic threshold like sprint interval training, you will achieve aerobic adaptations, just like we described in this lecture series, and you will experience an improvement in aerobic power and thus muscular endurance. Now keep in mind that there is no such thing as anaerobic fitness. This is something that is believed to be a real thing because many like to use the term anaerobic training to describe exercise above the anaerobic threshold, like sprint interval training or high intensity interval training, or like CrossFit, for example. But as you know, exercise above the anaerobic threshold is still very much aerobic. Again, the anaerobic system is simply a backup system to just fill the portion of ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot. There is never a case where the anaerobic system is fully isolated and is the only energy system providing that ATP. Aerobic system is the primary and prioritized energy system in your body, including your muscle. So it makes no sense to say someone is anaerobically fit. There is only aerobic fitness. You either have low aerobic power or high aerobic power, and thus low aerobic fitness or high aerobic fitness, respectively. So if you do your so-called quote-unquote anaerobic training like sprint interval training, and you experience an improvement in endurance or just simply you feel you are in better shape, do not attribute it to an improvement in so-called anaerobic fitness. It is due to an improvement in aerobic fitness or power. So let's not use terms like anaerobic exercise, anaerobic training, or anaerobic fitness because they do not make any sense from a scientific perspective. Now, during my exercise bioenergetics course, we will discuss these key training principles in much more detail and discuss the science behind conditioning or endurance training. And finally, for some more key training principles, the key for endurance trained individuals, so well-trained individuals, is anaerobic threshold. Robust VO2 max improvements in untrained individuals can be seen, but in trained individuals, VO2 max show very little improvements because again, with just 12 to 18 months of proper endurance training, one may achieve the highest possible VO2 max that they can obtain, which again is genetically determined. So anaerobic threshold is the more critical factor for an improvement in aerobic power and thus muscular endurance and performance in well-trained individuals. So for serious endurance athletes, it is important to not only assess your VO2 max, but also your anaerobic threshold. Again, you must train near your anaerobic threshold to improve aerobic power and therefore endurance performance. No stress equals no cardiovascular or muscle adaptations, which means no improvement in aerobic power, which means no improvement in endurance. This is a very important concept when it comes to endurance training or training in general for that matter.